Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so delighted to introduce this virtual event with Claudia Rankin presenting her new book, Just Us, An American Conversation, in conversation with KIERSTAN CARTER. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. We're hosting 5 events a week right here on Zoom. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Just Us on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. And thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am honored to introduce our speakers. Claudia Rankin is the author of Citizen, an American Lyric, and 4 previous books, including Don't Let Me Be Lonely, an American Lyric. Her work has appeared recently in The Guardian, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Times Magazine, and the Washington Post. She's a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, the winner of the 2014 Jackson Poetry Prize, and a contributing editor of Poets and Writers. She received a MacArthur Fellowship in 2016, and she is the Frederick Eisenman Professor of Poetry at Yale University. KIERSTAN CARTER is a doctoral candidate in African and African American Studies at Harvard. She studies the theoretical underpinnings of institutions in United States political life with a special emphasis on law, policing, and punishment. Her current work draws out the philosophical contributions of African American fictions. Tonight, they'll be discussing Claudia's latest book, Just Us, in which she focuses her nuanced, multifaceted, and multi-genre lens on a direct engagement of whiteness in America. From the swelling volume of overt white supremacy to the false comfort of concepts like politeness and neutrality that envelop a number of more insidious beliefs and prejudices. Through her conversations with strangers and friends, she extends us all an invitation to this necessary dialogue with the generosity of imagination, clarity, and wit that is emblematic of her work. 4 Columns applauds it as not only the most comprehensive articulation of the racial imaginary Rankin has ever put on paper, but as her magnum opus. And Judith Butler calls Just Us a brilliant and multi-layered work, a call, a bid, an insistent, rightly impatient demand for a public conversation on whiteness, and says, quite rightly, anyone who turns away from this bold and vital invitation to get to work would be a damn fool. And now I'm so excited to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Claudia and KIERSTAN.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Hi, KIERSTAN. How are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm doing okay.
Nice to see you back after the brief introduction.
Yes.
So I guess we can just jump into questions. And we've talked a little bit, and as it becomes relevant, we'll turn to readings. But I wanted to start with a question that requires a little bit of setup. So there's a moment in Just Us where you describe the 1988 Peggy McIntosh article that popularized the phrase white privilege. In it, she lists famously 46 different ways that white privilege is enacted. And when you write about this piece, like, you have this really wry and brilliant line about how you suspect McIntosh stopped at 46 as a way of saying, you get the point. And it strikes me that Just Us has a similar quality, that you could go on forever collecting the kinds of stories like the ones that you share in this book. And so I guess my opening question is why now? What felt urgent about this book? And how did you decide that you'd finally made your point sufficiently to respond to that urgency?
Well, we were, this book, it went to press a year ago, so before the present situation. But, we were in a situation where we had a sitting president who made claims that were totally false and fake news had become a thing. And I thought, well, it might be interesting to do the thing that no one was doing, which was, there was a lot of talk about how no one was talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, my students were saying, I'm not speaking to members of my family, people were in that moment. So I thought, because of the election. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to take conversations that I've had with people, some of them white, some of them not, and take them apart to see why and how we get derailed in these conversations. What are the things that come up for us, and what's the underpinning behind it? So the book, as you know, is organized. One side is the running conversations, and the other side is archival material, supporting material, however you want to. Some of it, some of it consists of photographs that I've taken, images that I think are relevant, but maybe you don't think is relevant, but I thought was relevant. And so I wanted the two sides to kind of pulse together and create a conversation that people supposedly weren't having, though of course that's not true. A lot of people were talking. Our president has given a lot of us a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Are there things you wish you could have added in light of COVID? I know you said the book went to press a year ago, but
I think every day there's something to add. If you're talking about the ways in which our country is built on white supremacy, every day there's a new thing to look at. Now we could think about the open Supreme Court seat and what are the implications of that going forward for all of us. And, why is it that Ginsburg tried to hold on for as long as she did, despite the fact that she was obviously ill? So, Sarah Cooper was something that would have found its way into Just Us.
Okay. Yeah.
That had happened previously. So if I had a fantasy about Just Us as a living, breathing document, it would be that everyone would add in their own references, their own, take the body of their own knowledge and bring it to the places that they feel it's relevant, so that it would extend out in a way. Yeah,
absolutely. No, I think that's totally right. I would be happy to participate in an ongoing archive of that. If somebody, one of our attendees, wants to take the lead on that. I actually want to turn to a question that we got from the audience. Someone said that in an earlier interview you'd mentioned that you prefer the phrase white living to white privilege. And I think it would be great if you could expand on that for folks who haven't maybe read the book yet.
Well, the initial essay, the very first essay before the book was a book, was an essay I wrote for the New York Times. I started working on it and I didn't really think it was a news-based essay, but when I showed it to my editor at the Times, she said, no, I think we would actually like this. And it came about because I was teaching a class at Yale called The Constructions of Whiteness. And many of my students would interview family members or suite mates or, and about what it meant to be white or what it meant to exist inside a culture of whiteness. So I thought, why don't I try that? Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, 62% of white men voted for this president. So why don't I talk to them? Mm. And I don't normally speak to them. They're not part of my, they're strangers. So obviously they're not part of my world, but not even in an incidental way. I think even in my sort of random encounters, I rarely seek out strange white men to talk to
Yeah.
in liminal spaces like airports. So I decided to do that. And so that's how the book began with that. But then I realized that every time I brought up the term white privilege or white male privilege, I got the narrative of I've worked hard in my life, and then I thought, oh, it's the bootstraps narrative, the erasure narrative. So they're misunderstanding me. They don't really understand what I'm asking them. So I then started saying, I don't mean economic privilege. This is not what I'm asking you about. And from there, I got to white living, because it was, I think when you talk to white people and you tell them, I don't have what you have, they think you're talking about something monetary, like I don't have your car or your house. They take for granted the fact that they can just leave their house and walk down the street and not be accosted and not be under surveillance 24/7 for granted. And so it's really about white mobility. And that's how I got to white living, as a more efficient way to have the conversation around what it means for white people to be themselves and for me to be a Black woman in the world.
Yeah, that's super powerful. I'm curious, now that you've said that part of how you got to white living was this miscommunication that was happening over and over again. It strikes me that in a lot of the pieces in the book, you're just like continually confronting people who aren't able to conceptualize their whiteness. And so I wonder if you can say a little bit about how much of that is things getting lost in translation and how much of that is an almost functional kind of ignorance, if that makes sense, that there is something to not being able to understand the question in its fullness.
Well, I think the narrative given to all of us, not just to white people, is that white people are the people. Mm. And the rest of us, as Toni Morrison has said, are hyphenated. So if you think you're just the people, then you don't have to think about how it is you became the people in the general way. And so when you walk it back to how whiteness equals the general state of American, that's when you begin to understand the slavery, the genocide, and fold it out into all of the historical moves that have allowed white people that ignorance. That's part of the narrative of the ignorance. One of the things I appreciate in the work of Robin DiAngelo is a moment when she says, when white people say, I don't know, the correct response to that is, how could you not know? Mm-hmm. Like, yeah. How did you manage the BA, the PhD, the JD, the whatever, the medical degrees, without knowing about how whiteness was centralized in your life, to make your life, to allow your life,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is an interesting thing in part because it comes up again and again, right? So like Baldwin has this piece about like the innocence, or the white innocence is part of the like damage that whiteness does. And I'm curious, now that you've done so much thinking and writing and teaching about whiteness, how, if at all, like your thinking on whiteness, its contents and its meanings has changed over that time. Because I think that there are a few things that are consistent, that you can kind of trace. Here is how Black political thinkers or Black artists have been conceptualizing whiteness. I'm curious what your process has been over the last couple of years.
Well, I think often the discussions have entered through Black pain, through mm-hmm. Black suffering, and that allows white people to drop out. Mm-hmm. They can stand over here and say, oh my God, I really feel bad that he was shot in the back 7 times, without really focusing on how he was shot and Breonna Taylor was shot, you know, Jacob Blake was, you know, it's like the constant surprise means that there was something in the way the information is presented that allows the distancing of whiteness from the presentation of the subject, of the dehumanization of Black people. So the thought was, how do you tell the same story but come in to the front door and change the lens so that we get to see the entire picture? And so much of the work I've done in the last few years is to try and shift the way the story gets told so that you cannot lose the aggressor in the spectacle of the person who is subject to that aggression. So, you know, like there's an image in Just Us of Dylan Roof entering and leaving the church.
Yeah.
If you don't know what he did in that church, you might lose the context of that image. But if you understand that 9 dead people are in the basement of that church, having entered the church for Bible study, then you literally get the story through Dylan Roof's entrance into the church, which also falls back into all of the churches that have been bombed and all of the people who have been killed inside that construction, which is why Dylan Roof chose it. You know, he understood the historical relevance of killing people inside the church.
Absolutely. You know, that leads me to, I think, another question, which isn't where I thought we were going to go with this conversation, but I think that kind of brings to mind for me Saidiya Hartman's concern about reproducing scenes of Black pain and the fear that you're always kind of on the line between spectating and enjoying seeing Black pain. And so as somebody whose work really involves visual pieces, you know, if you go back to Don't Let Me Be Lonely, Citizen, these are like very visually dense pieces. How did you wrestle with that tension?
Well, that, you know, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, how do you not lose the event, the devastating event, but also not turn the death of Black people into a subject without an object, or an object without a subject, actually. You know, that the dead person just is there, and then we are full of grief. But what happens if you walk it back? You know, where do you land? And you land inside the entire system that allows for that. I'm actually working on a series of lectures about this right now. This notion of what are the ways in which people have managed to bring it forward. I think about somebody like Arthur Jaffa, for example. He brings the suffering, but he also brings the joy and the music and the church and everything else, so that it gets embedded in a larger narrative. Many artists have erased the body of the person so you can see the white aggressor. You know, everybody's sort of circling different approaches to this, because the circulation, the constant circulation of dead people who've been shot or lying on the ground, like in the case of Michael Brown, or Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck. That is traumatizing for people to see again and again and again. But then do you also want to erase them? That's the flip side of that. And that becomes also a problem. So it's a difficult conundrum to think about what the image does. You know, I've just been reading W.T. Mitchell's What Do Images Want? And he talks about the Twin Towers in New York, and that the plane going into the towers, that's the image that was wanted. The deaths, according to him, are collateral damage. They're devastating and horrible, but that's not the point. The point is to be able to put out an image that shows the destruction of capitalism as presented by those buildings. So, you know, it's always like, what can the image do? What, you know, so all that to say, I don't have an answer, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot about.
No, I think that's right. There's just, and I often have this experience when I'm reading your work where I'm trying to figure out almost in those exact same words, like what the image wants. Like there's a really beautiful like reading of an image that you do in the book, in Outstretched, that just, I think, really captures that moment. Yeah, so I have a question that's a little bit tangential to this, and kind of brings us back just a bit. So you have a piece that reworks Thomas Jefferson's infamous Notes on the State of Virginia. And it's a piece that I really associate with the study of slavery in the United States. And to the extent that I would be surprised to find somebody who's professionally in African-American or Black studies who wouldn't have something to say about it. And to borrow your phrase about, you know, trying to enter the conversation through the front door, you reworked it for something like critical whiteness studies. And I'm curious if you think that piece is something of a test balloon for where critical whiteness studies can go. Like, I know it's a field that's had a hard time finding a place to be, if that makes sense. So it begins in labor history. It's got other roots in critical race theory broadly. So I'm curious about where you see this work settling ultimately.
Well, one of my pet peeves is that many of our noted scholars have managed to teach their subjects without looking at the repressed history of whiteness, so that you know, I had, as a graduate student and as an undergrad, took a lot of poetry classes and read a lot about Whitman, and was told that Whitman, you know, was an abolitionist, and Whitman this and Whitman that. And then when you go and check out what Whitman's actually saying, I don't know if I necessarily want him on my side, you know? So, but that's not taught. So the whole issue is not taught. The fact that his religion makes him believe that people shouldn't be slaves doesn't mean he isn't as anti-Black and as racist as the next guy. And why people feel like they have to get rid of that part of it and just give us the I am everyone, Whitman, is part of the kind of socialization in the benevolence of whiteness. So one of the things I wanted from the Notes on Virginia is, you know, can we go back to the moments that have been taught and bring forward the whole story, the entire story? and also we know more now than we did then. So we have access to archives, we have access, so I can take it. I can take the complexity of individuals who came up in an anti-Black culture and who did some good things and also don't like Black people. I personally can take it. So why are we going into classrooms and not getting the whole story? What is that?
Yeah.
And so that's part of what I would like to see happen. I went to a lecture about Manet's Olympia.
Mm-hmm.
And the scholar who wrote about Olympia's Choice managed to write an entire book on the white lady lying on the couch and spent, one sentence on the Black woman standing there. And yet he is the preeminent scholar on Manet's Olympia. How is that possible?
Yeah.
I had a friend just recently tell me that they were at a dissertation and the person was a genius who was defending their dissertation, but that they weren't able to read the work of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, how are they genius if they can only read the work of white people and couldn't read the work of Black people? What is the foundation for the genius in that sentence? So that's, so part of my desire, my aspirational living, is to have the complexity of the history show up inside our classrooms from day one, so that people have the full story.
That really reminded me of the piece. There's a piece at the very end of Robin Cost-Lewis's the Voyage of the Sable Venus, where she describes suddenly realizing that she hasn't seen like the figure of the Black woman despite spending all this time in museums, and how she has to like go back and learn how to see again. And I think that
exactly. I mean, that piece by Robin is a fantastic piece, and I think that's partly what she's doing. She's recirculating the material so that what has been disappeared and repressed can come back into the entire story.
Can I ask, this is gonna sound like a strange question, but why whiteness? So at a time when there's like lots of concern about our ability to construct some kind of collective political life, there might be any number of axes along which you might think we should be having a like really intense discussion about it. So say masculinity or nationalism. Why whiteness? What work do you think whiteness is doing in building a better conversation?
Well, because there is no nationalism without whiteness. That's what white supremacy is, in my mind. The foundations of this country, one of the things that our president said was, I'm a nationalist, use that word. So there is no, for me, white supremacy, white nationalism is the foundation of whiteness. It's what we were built on. We were told in 1790 that the people who could vote and own property were white Anglo-Saxon men. Since then, people have been fighting to expand that definition. So masculinity, white masculinity, patriarchy, and white nationalism form the narrative of whiteness in this country. There's no in to whiteness without thinking about white nationalism. There's no into whiteness without thinking about patriarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about if you find, so Just Us is a work of auto theory, in the sense that you are engaging, I think, social theory to make sense of the conversations and encounters and interactions that you're having on a regular basis. And I wonder if there's ever a moment where you feel let down by theory, if that makes sense, as if having a way to describe something is not quite, it's too sanitized, or it's not quite the same as, you know, being able to account for the betrayal that maybe makes up ethical loneliness.
Well, if my only recourse was theory in Just Us, then maybe that might be the case.
Mm.
But it, you know, the book goes where it needs to go. So if it's image, it goes to image. If it's a tweet, it goes to Twitter. If it's, you know, there was no genre that I felt I couldn't use. If it's from the archives, it's from the archives. If it's from an art gallery, a newspaper, the private papers of someone, a painting. So it wasn't, I didn't think of theory as the only, it's one way to help me investigate what's behind a tendency to say this or a feeling in this moment. You know, I think Just Us is a book that is not for everyone. Let's put it that way. It's a book that asks people to have a kind of subtlety and flexibility about where they take information from. Like if you're looking for a story that goes, I arrived, I murdered the guy and I left, this is not the book for you. If you're looking for, you know, it's an experimental book. It's like a book that comes out of the tradition of a Dicté or Stein, or, you know, it's a book that moves around and is interested not in a solution or a prescription, but a process.
Mm.
And it asks you to be able to use the verso side of the page as a place of rest and contemplation.
Mm.
So maybe I'll go over here and think about this image of some upper class people carrying a monkey down the steps and wonder why was that posted when a mixed race child was born, you know, or a tweet referring to Michelle Obama as an ape in high heels. Like, what is the history that makes white people feel like using animals to describe Black people is okay?
Mm.
And they can go public with that. And then they can complain, you know, that they're being attacked unjustly.
Yes.
So it's not about educating anybody or about providing a prescription or solution. It's using theory, it's using art, it's using tweets, it's using popular culture, sociology, whatever, to open up the space of contemplation around these issues. Not to solve them, but to open up. That's why I say anybody could actually bring in their own sources inside these referential moments. Because I was really interested in how do you make the page open up to the curiosity and the process of thinking about these issues. You know, and I think a certain kind of reader believes that it's there for education. It's not, I'm not interested in educating anyone, or it's there, and then they get disappointed because there's no solution. But I'm not presenting a solution. I'm actually interested in the complexity, the complex, nuanced ripple effect of contemplation around an issue.
Yeah, I'll say for context for people who haven't read the book and are going to buy the book afterwards, that it has a really interesting form. So if you could talk a little bit about the dots, the red dots, and then what you call the verso page, the page that is a lot of times blank. Yeah.
Well, I wanted a form that mimicked the subject in a way. Like I wanted the subject of the book is, what does it mean to have a conversation? What does it mean for you and I to build something between us and then get derailed by an act of racism? Or something that's misunderstood around how race works in this culture. And the way in conversations, we are often talking but thinking at the same time. So you say something to me and it reminds me of something and I'm thinking of that thing. I might not necessarily tell you I'm thinking of that thing, but I am thinking of it. And it could be an image. It could be a tweet I saw yesterday. It could be something in Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. And it comes to me. So I wanted that moment in the conversation where those things were pressing on you to be made evident. And so there's a red dot, almost like those markers that you use on boards, that repeats the sentence on the opposing page, on the verso page, and then fact checks it and says, this is maybe true, maybe not true, could be true, yes, no, and then gives information as to why it is true or why it isn't. Or it could just be an image that moment solicited in my mind. And it might mean nothing to you, or it might mean something to you.
Yeah.
You might see, look over and think, I'm not interested in that, and just keep reading. That's also a possibility. And what I love about the sort of structure of this book is you're not forced to take in the rest. If you don't want it, don't take it. You can just read the conversation and be done with it. Or you can spend your time on the images and thinking about where that came from and why did she put it in and what does it have to do with this moment. Or you can, do whatever you want. But it allows, I wanted the structure of the book to engage other senses, not just thinking, but also seeing, and then allow the reader to wander, to go where they go, given this image or this tweet or this, and I think it's not as, I hoped it would not be as constrained, but really freeing in terms of the reading process.
Did you imagine that folks would read it from beginning to end? Like kind of you said earlier that, if somebody's looking for a book that starts with a murder and ends with a conviction, that's not the book. But do you imagine that this is the kind of thing that people will come back to or will read in spurts? I know that my experience of Citizen is sometimes like that. There are parts of it that come to me in moments and I feel kind of drawn to them. Is that kind of how you imagine Just Us living?
Well, maybe that's a question for you. I mean, what was your reading experience with Just Us?
So full disclosure, I'm writing a review of Just Us. So I read it front to back and took way more notes than I would if I were just reading it for pleasure. But there were several pieces that really struck me. Like I found myself returning to What If, to Lemonade, to different pieces of it that just sat somewhere with me, and I could imagine them being kind of freestanding, and so and maybe this is the purpose of the subtitle, right? The conversation. It's not in a form per se, the way that maybe you've worked in lyric before. Yeah. So do you imagine that folks will read it as a trilogy? You've written several like subtitled American pieces. Do you see them fitting together in a particular way?
I do think so. I mean, I think they were all written in conversation with our times.
Mm.
And my attempt to capture dynamics that were happening.
Mm.
Don't Let Me Be Lonely began with the run up to the presidency for George Bush, and then September 11th happened. And so then we were in a culture of fear that was being built, and you could see it being built around us. And I could feel its effect on me. I could feel myself turning into someone who questioned other people's presence. And I wanted the book to sort of investigate that. And it was a book that was located in New York, and it was, while that was happening, we also had intense police violence with Amadou Diabo. All kinds of things were happening, and those were also inside the building of Lonely. Citizen was an attempt to show microaggressions because they went so quickly, they happened so quickly and they disappear. And I wanted to come up with a form that could capture them, that, where people could go inside that you of those pieces and land inside a dynamic that really goes like that.
Yeah.
With Just Us, as I said, I was really interested in our moment where we are getting so far from each other. And, a lot of us are in interracial marriages. We work with all kinds of people. We live with all kinds of people. And yet, segregation remains a thing. People like my neighbors across the street have never said 2 words to me, and I could tell you a story about them, but I will not. around that kind of issue. But so I really was interested when you have somebody in the position of power, as Donald Trump is, advocating for an us versus them mentality, almost like a civil war dynamic within the United States. What does it mean if we aren't able to speak to those people we are in contact with, honestly, about how white supremacy is at work now? And it is at work now. We've had a 50% rise in white supremacist groups across the country. Almost all of the race-related hate crimes have been white supremacy against someone else. Mm-hmm. The FBI came out with a report not long ago. So I think, we can't continue acting like white nationalism is not a thing here, and that whiteness has not an investment in that. So hence, Just Us.
I was, to kind of pull on what you were saying about how most of us, I think, are in very just diverse spaces, right? You work with white people, you work with people who look different from you. I'm especially curious, there's parts of the book where you talk about really intimate relationships. So one of the questions in the queue is about going to the play with your friend and how she doesn't stand at the end when the actor asks everybody to, all the white people to like join the stage. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the process that you went through for writing the book. So where you would write out, you know, how you understood what happened, and then the process of sharing that with people that you know are friends with, that you're married to, that you work with, and kind of making those, what in Citizen were kind of these quick moments, really elaborate, and kind of like asking people to sit in those moments much longer than they would have otherwise.
Exactly. I mean, you know, I intentionally wanted to show myself in this book because I felt if I was going to ask other people to show up for the conversation and share the conversation, then I really wanted to track what was happening with me, so that I wasn't in a position where I was outside the dynamics. I was really inside the dynamic. And so in the piece that you refer to, I go to see Fairview by Jackie Sibley's. And in Fairview, it's a really amazing play, meta play, about, in a way, how white people look at Black people. Their ideas about Blackness, not necessarily about Black people at all, but about white people's gaze on that. And in the play, at the end of the play, one of the characters, she comes to the audience and she says, what if the white people in the space of the audience get up and walk to the stage and give this space to the people of color, so that we can enact in this room something that doesn't belong, you know, doesn't happen in the real world, that doesn't belong to the realities we all share.
Yeah.
And it's a simple ask. It's like, can you just get up for a minute and walk over there and stand on stage, and we will conduct this little experiment. And the woman I'm with, I'm actually with my husband, daughter, and a friend. And the woman I'm with sits there, and she's a white woman. And she sits there, and she sits there, and she sits there. And I find myself becoming more and more enraged. And I don't want to turn to her and say, get up and go, because part of what you want is a decision made, not a request answered, you know, like not a personal request answered.
Yeah.
The play presented something, and could she in this moment just enact that? No, apparently no, she couldn't. And I was curious about my own sense of disappointment. It was a way to think about liberals, white liberals in this. And so I wrote it down. For this project, I had hired a psychiatrist. And so I brought the piece to the psychiatrist and I said, you know, why do you think I was so enraged? What's going on here? Why is she acting like this? What do you think is going on with her? And my psychiatrist is a white woman, and she's done a lot of work on feminism, white patriarchy. And so we would have these really interesting conversations. And then I would go back and fold in some of the things I learned during the therapy. And then I would send the essay to a fact checker that I employed for this. And he and I would go through the essay and try and figure out what the backstory, in terms of the historical backstory, is in some of the assumptions that we bring to these moments, you know, just historically. And then I also would just associate in terms of images, or where have I seen this behavior before? What's happened in the news recently? And those things would have been added. And then I take the essay and I bring it to the person it's about, who I had the conversation with.
Yeah.
And I say, you know, we had this conversation. Will you read this? Tell me if there's anything you think is incorrect. And will you respond?
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, no one has ever said, you can't publish this. Everyone has said, yes, this is the conversation we had. But sometimes they say, but it's not what I meant. You misunderstand what I was doing here. And then I say, fine, just explain to me what you were doing. And I'll add that into the conversation. So what you'll get, depending on how willing someone is to participate, is their own read on the conversation. And sometimes I then respond to that in terms of what surprises me in their response.
Would you recommend people do that in their personal lives?
I would recommend follow-up phone calls, yeah. You know, sometimes you need a little time to think. And then you could call back and say, hey, you know, I didn't quite get that. What was that?
To finish the question that the audience member asked earlier, they wanted to know if that experience at Fairview influenced you in your final scene for the white card.
No, I had written the white card before Fairview.
Okay.
So I think, I don't know if Jackie and I were working on the different plays at the same time, but I hadn't seen Fairview in the process of doing the white card.
Were there, so you mentioned your neighbors across the street. Are there things that you wanted to add to the book that didn't make the final cut?
There was one conversation I had, but it was too much. It was too, what can I say, too short maybe of an interaction. But I went to walk my dog one morning. I think I was on the phone. So I went to walk my dog and I left my house. I just like opened the door, walked out, and I forgot to turn off the alarm. So I had triggered the alarm by opening the door. But then I walked the dog and I came back and there were policemen all over my house, you know, in front of and they were like walking around the house. And so I came up and I said, oh, damn, you know, sorry, I that was me, my bad. And so I opened my door, disconnected the alarm, came back to the front door and was kind of, you know, chatting with the police guy. There were more than one, but there was one that was talking to me. And he and I were like, yeah, you know, this happens, blah, 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 blah. And then my husband drives up. And he gets out of his car and he comes leaping down because he sees all these policemen and me. And then the policeman, the guy I've been talking to, the guy who stood there while I opened the door and went and turned the lock, you know, the alarm off, and then came back to the front door, he says to my husband, she said she lives here. And I had one of those moments.
Yep.
And it was like, you know, I would have loved to have written that down and given it to him. Yeah. Let's talk about this. That's one of the moments.
That is a perfect summary of this book. I'm sad that did not make it.
Like, I don't see how she could live here, but she says she lives here.
Oh man, yep. Nope, that tracks. We are coming up very close to our time. So I wanted to know at the very end if there were pieces that you wanted to read from the book.
Should I read a little bit of the opening section, maybe?
I personally love What If Part 3, but that's
okay.
just
Okay, I will do it. I will, well, why don't I do 1, 3, and the final one? How's it? Because they're short.
That sounds great.
What does it mean to want an age-old call for change, not to change? And yet also to feel bullied by the call to change? How is a call to change named shame, named penance, named chastisement? How does one say, what if, without reproach? The root of chastise is to make pure. The impossibility of that. Is that what repels and not the call for change? What if over tea? What if on our walks? What if in the long yawn of the fog? What if in the long middle of the wait? What if in the passage? In the what if that carries us each day into seasons? What if in the renewed resilience? What if in the endlessness? What if in a lifetime of conversations? What if in the clarity of consciousness? What if nothing changes? What if what I want from you is new, newly made, a new sentence in response to all my questions, a swerve in our relation and the words that carry us, the care that carries. I am here without the shrug, attempting to understand how what I want and what I want from you run parallel. Justice and the openings for just us.
Amazing. Claudia Rankin, thank you so much for sharing this space with me and with everybody who is able to join the Zoom call. If you haven't already, audience members, you should definitely go buy Just Us. It is a beautiful, brilliant, and timely work, as always. I think.
Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to thank both of you for that incredible conversation, and thank you, Claudia, for closing with that beautiful reading. Thank you out there, all of you, for spending your evening with us. And as Kirsten said, better than I could, please check out Just Us at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night, keep reading, and stay safe. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.